They said they won't operate without payment, not tonight. Lily Carter's voice trembled as she stared at her phone, the message from the hospital billing desk still glowing on the cracked screen. Each word pressing down on her chest like a weight she couldn't lift, her fingers tightening around the device as the sterile scent of disinfectant filled her lungs and the distant beeping of machines echoed down the corridor, reminding her that somewhere, just a few doors away, her child was lying in a hospital bed, waiting for something she couldn't afford to give. And for a moment, she stood frozen under the harsh fluorescent lights, her breath shallow, her thoughts racing too fast to catch, before something inside her snapped, and she started moving again, faster this time. Her worn sneakers squeaking against the polished floor as she clutched the strap of her bag and ran past nurses, past waiting families, past doors marked with numbers she could barely read through the blur of tears, her vision swimming as she tried to remember what the nurse had said, which room, which floor, where she was supposed to go next. But everything had become noise. Everything except the fear pounding in her ears, louder than anything else, louder than reason, louder than the voice telling her to slow down, to think, to breathe. And then she saw a door slightly ajar at the end of the hallway, a soft glow spilling out from inside. And without stopping, without checking the number, without thinking at all, she pushed it open, her hand trembling as it met the cold metal handle and forced it forward, stepping inside as if crossing a line she didn't even realize existed, her words spilling out before she could stop them. Please, I need help. I don't have the money, but my son, he needs surgery tonight. I'll do anything. I'll sign anything. Just don't let them turn us away. Her voice breaking, her chest heaving as she finally looked up, expecting a nurse, a doctor, anyone who could say yes or no, anyone who could give her something solid to hold on to. But instead the room fell silent in a way that didn't belong in a hospital, a heavy, controlled silence that made her heartbeat suddenly too loud, too exposed, and standing just a few feet away was a man who didn't look like he belonged to this place at all, tall, composed, dressed in a charcoal suit that fit like it had been made for him, his presence commanding the room in a way that made everything else fade, his eyes locked on her with an intensity that made her breath catch mid-sentence. As if the world had shifted in that exact second, and she was the only one who hadn't been warned, and behind him, a sleek leather chair, a folder of documents on a polished table, a quiet assistant frozen near the wall, all of it too still, too controlled, like she had stepped into a completely different reality by mistake, and for a second, just 1 second, Lily forgot why she was there at all, her mind scrambling to catch up, her body suddenly aware of every detail. Her damp hair clinging to her face, the tear stains on her cheeks, the cheap fabric of her jacket that suddenly fell out of place under his gaze, and she took a step back instinctively, her hand tightening on the door as the realization hit her that she had made a mistake, that this wasn't the room she was supposed to be in, that whoever this man was, he wasn't the one she had been looking for, and the words were already forming in her mouth, an apology, an excuse. Anything to get out before she embarrassed herself further, but then he moved, just slightly, just enough to break the stillness. And something in his expression changed, not shock, not confusion, but recognition, sharp and immediate. As if he had been waiting for this exact moment without knowing when it would come, his gaze tracing her face with unsettling precision, lingering in a way that made her pulse spike, and before she could turn, before she could retreat, before she could even understand what was happening, his voice cut through the silence, low and steady, carrying a certainty that didn't belong to a stranger. I've been looking for you. Lily's breath caught in her throat, the words landing too precisely, too personally, as if they had been meant for her and her alone. And for a moment she could not move, could not think, her mind rejecting what she had just heard because it did not make sense, because nothing about this situation made sense. Her fingers tightening around the edge of the door as she shook her head slightly, a fragile attempt to regain control. I think you have the wrong person, she managed, her voice uneven, her instinct screaming at her to leave, to step back into the hallway and find the right room, the right person, the right reality where things were still explainable. But his gaze did not shift, did not soften. If anything, it sharpened, as if her denial had only confirmed something in his mind. And that unsettled her more than anything else, the quiet confidence in his expression, the way he did not question himself even for a second. "No," he said simply, the single word steady and deliberate, carrying a weight that made her chest tighten, and she felt suddenly exposed, as if he could see through the layers she had built to survive the past few years. The exhaustion, the fear, the constant calculation of what she could afford, and what she had to sacrifice, all of it laid bare under that unwavering stare. "You do not understand," she tried again, forcing herself to speak, to push back against whatever this was. "I am looking for someone else, my son is." Her voice broke again, the urgency flooding back as reality crashed in, and she turned slightly toward the door, her body ready to move, to run if she had to. But then his voice stopped her, not louder, not harsher, just perfectly timed. "How old is he?" The question hit her like a sudden drop in temperature, unexpected and immediate, and she froze, her hand still on the door, her thoughts stumbling over themselves as she tried to process why that was the first thing he asked. Not who she was, not why she was here, but that, and her instinct was to deflect, to protect the one thing that mattered most. "That is none of your business," she said quickly, the words coming out sharper than she intended. But she did not care. She could not afford to care. Not right now, not when every second mattered. But instead of reacting with offense, he stepped closer, just enough to close the distance without overwhelming her, his presence controlled, intentional, as if every movement had been calculated. And when he spoke again, his voice dropped slightly, softer but somehow more intense. "It is if I am right," he said, and something in the way he said it sent a chill down her spine, a quiet certainty that did not belong to coincidence, her heart beginning to race again, not from running this time, but from something deeper, something she did not want to name, because naming it would make it real, and she could not afford that either. Not here, not now. "You are not right," she insisted, but the conviction was already slipping, her thoughts drifting unwillingly to fragments she had buried, memories she had locked away because they were easier to ignore than to explain. And before she could stop herself, her grip on the door loosened slightly, her body no longer moving toward escape, but caught in place between leaving and staying. And then, as if the moment needed one more push, the sharp sound of hurried footsteps echoed from the hallway, followed by a nurse's voice calling out urgently, "Lily Carter?" The name sliced through the tension, grounding her instantly, and she turned toward the door, her focus snapping back to where it needed to be. "Yes," she called out, her voice rising with desperation as the nurse appeared in the doorway, her expression serious but controlled, the kind of expression that never brought good news. "We need you in pre-op immediately. Your son's condition is getting worse." The words landed fast, efficient, leaving no room for interpretation, and Lily felt the world tilt again, the urgency returning full force, overriding everything else, every question, every strange moment that had just unfolded, because none of it mattered more than that. And without another thought, she stepped into the hallway, her body already moving. But just as she passed him, just as she crossed that invisible line back into the reality she understood, his voice followed her, quieter this time, but no less certain. "Lily," he said, her name rolling off his tongue like it belonged there, like it always had. And she faltered for the briefest second, her steps slowing despite herself, her heart skipping in a way she could not control. "I know you do not remember," he continued, and there was something in his tone now, something almost restrained, like he was holding back more than he was saying, "but I do." And she did not turn around. She could not yet, not when fear and confusion were colliding inside her, not when the only thing she could focus on was getting to her son before it was too late. But as she disappeared down the corridor, one thought followed her whether she wanted it to or not. How could a stranger say her name like that and sound like he had never forgotten it? The hallway seemed longer than before as Lily followed the nurse at a near run, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, every second stretching painfully as the double doors to pre-operative swung open and the colder, sharper smell of antiseptic wrapped around her, machines humming softly in the background, controlled, precise, nothing like the chaos inside her chest. And then she saw him, her son, lying small against the oversized hospital bed, his pale face framed by soft curls damp with sweat, a thin blanket pulled carefully over him, as if that alone could protect him from everything threatening to take him away. And the sight stopped her completely. All the fear, all the confusion collapsing into one single point of focus. Mom. His voice was faint but unmistakable, and she was at his side instantly, her hand finding his, warm but weaker than it should have been. I am right here, she whispered, forcing her voice steady even as her eyes filled again, brushing his hair back gently, memorizing every detail because the thought of losing any of it was unbearable. The nurse speaking nearby, but her words barely registering until one phrase cut through. We are preparing him now, but we need authorization and payment confirmation to proceed. And just like that, the fragile moment shattered, reality pressing in again. Lily straightening slightly, her grip tightening on the bed rail as she turned toward the nurse. I told them I am trying. I just need a little more time, she said quickly, the desperation creeping back into her tone. Please, you cannot delay this, you said. His condition is getting worse. The nurse's expression softened but did not change, the kind of practiced empathy that still followed rules. We are doing everything we can, but the surgery team is on standby. We need clearance to move forward. And Lily nodded, even though the words did not help, because she already knew what that meant. She had been hearing it in different forms all day, all leading to the same impossible place. And for a moment she closed her eyes, trying to think, trying to find something she had missed, someone she could call, some option that had not already been exhausted. But her mind kept circling back to the same truth. There was no one left, no backup, no safety net. Just her and a situation she could not fix on her own. And as that realization settled in, something else began to surface, something she had tried to push away the moment she left that room. The memory of his voice, calm and certain, the way he had said her name, the way he had asked about her. Son, like it mattered, like it meant something beyond simple curiosity. And she shook her head slightly as if to clear it, because it did not make sense, because she did not have time for things that did not make sense. But then her son's fingers tightened weakly around hers, pulling her attention back. Mom, are we going home soon? He asked softly, and the question broke something inside her, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to make her inhale sharply before forcing a small smile. Soon, she said, even though she did not know if it was true, even though she could not promise it. I just need to take care of a few things, okay? He nodded slightly, trusting her completely in a way that made the weight of her situation feel even heavier. And as she leaned down to press a gentle kiss to his forehead, her decision formed without her fully realizing it. Because sometimes there was no clear answer, only the next step you were willing to take. And when she straightened again, her eyes were different, still filled with fear, but steadier, more resolved. And she turned back toward the nurse, her voice quieter now but firm. Give me 10 minutes, she said, and before the nurse could respond, she was already moving, already heading back toward the hallway, back toward the one person she did not understand but could not ignore, because somehow, against all logic, he might be the only chance she had left. The hallway felt colder this time as Lily moved back through it, her steps slower now, more deliberate, as if each one carried the weight of a decision she could not take back. The sounds of the hospital returning in fragments around her, distant voices, the soft roll of a cart, the steady rhythm of machines that never stopped, and yet none of it seemed as loud as the thoughts in her head, repeating the same question over and over. Why him? Why did he say those things? Why did it feel like more than coincidence? And when she reached the door again, she hesitated, her hand hovering just inches from the handle, her reflection faint in the polished surface, eyes red, shoulders tense. Someone who had nothing left to bargain with except hope she did not fully understand. And then she pushed it open once more, the quiet inside unchanged, controlled, almost untouched by the urgency outside. Adrian Blackwood standing exactly where she had left him, as if he had not moved at all, as if he had been waiting for her to come back. And the moment their eyes met again, that same unsettling recognition passed between them, sharper this time, heavier, because now she had chosen to return. You came back, he said, not surprised, just acknowledging what he had already expected. And Lily swallowed, forcing herself to step inside, closing the door behind her with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have, sealing the space, sealing the moment. I do not have time for whatever this is, she said, her voice steadier than before, but still carrying the strain underneath. My son needs surgery, and they will not move forward without payment. So if you know something, if you think you know me, then say it clearly because I cannot stand here guessing. The words came faster now, driven by urgency rather than fear, and for the first time his expression shifted slightly, not losing control, but revealing something underneath, something closer to tension than calm. And he took a step toward the table, picking up a thin folder, his movements precise, controlled, before setting it back down as if deciding against something, his attention returning fully to her. How old is your son? He asked again. The same question, unchanged, as if everything hinged on that single answer. And Lily let out a breath, frustration flickering across her face. 6, she said finally, the number leaving her lips before she could stop it, because arguing was wasting time. She did not have, and for a fraction of a second, something in his posture shifted, not visibly dramatic but unmistakable, like a calculation had just aligned, his jaw tightening slightly, his gaze dropping for the briefest moment before returning to her with a new intensity. And that was when the unease in her chest deepened into something harder to ignore. What does that mean? She asked, her voice lower now, more cautious, because she could feel the direction this was moving even if she did not understand how. And he did not answer immediately, instead studying her again, as if confirming something only he could see. 6 years, he repeated quietly, almost to himself, and then he looked at her fully, his voice steady but carrying a weight that made her pulse quicken. There was a storm that night, he said, and the words landed strangely, out of place yet precise, like the beginning of a memory she had tried to forget. The highway was shut down, the city lost power for hours. And you were standing outside a closed clinic with nowhere to go. Lily's breath caught, her mind stalling for a second before rushing backward, fragments breaking loose despite her resistance. Rain against pavement, flickering lights, a night she had buried because remembering it had never changed anything, and she shook her head instinctively, taking a step back. That could be anyone, she said quickly, but her voice lacked the certainty it had before, and he did not argue, did not raise his voice. He simply took another step closer, closing the distance just enough that she could no longer pretend this was coincidence. You were not just anyone, he said, and there was no hesitation in it. No doubt. You were the only one who stayed when everyone else left. And the words settled between them, heavy and unfinished, carrying more meaning than he was saying. And Lily felt her chest tighten, not from fear this time, but from the realization that whatever had happened that night, whatever she had tried to leave behind, it had not disappeared the way she thought it had. It had been waiting, just like he said, waiting for her to walk into the wrong room and hear the one thing she could not ignore anymore. Lily felt the air leave her lungs slowly, like something inside her had been pressed too tightly for too long and was finally giving way. The memory he had just described no longer distant, no longer something she could dismiss, because it was too specific, too exact, the kind of detail that could not be guessed or assumed. And she shook her head again, but this time it was weaker, more uncertain. That does not prove anything, she said, though the words sounded thin even to her own ears, her mind already betraying her, pulling her back into that night whether she wanted it or not. The cold rain soaking through her jacket, the streetlights flickering as the power cut in and out, the sound of sirens somewhere far away, and a stranger standing there, injured, disoriented, someone she should have walked past like everyone else but did not, because she never could, not when someone needed help, not when she understood what it felt like to have no one stop. And she pressed her lips together, forcing herself back into the present, because none of that mattered now, none of it changed the situation she was in. Even if that happened, even if I helped someone that night, it does not explain this, she added, her voice firmer, grounding herself in the only thing that mattered. My son is in that room right now, and I do not have time to chase memories. And for the first time, Adrian's expression shifted in a way that revealed something deeper, not doubt, but something closer to restraint, like he was choosing his next words carefully, aware of how much they would change. And he took a breath, subtle but deliberate, before speaking again. You did more than help, he said, and there was no exaggeration in his tone, No dramatics, just a quiet statement of fact that carried more weight than anything louder could have. You stayed with me for hours when you had no reason to, when you could have walked away like everyone else, and you made sure I did not lose consciousness before the ambulance arrived. Lily's fingers curled slightly at her sides, the details aligning too clearly now. The memory no longer fragmented, but whole, and she could see it. The man leaning against the wall, barely able to stand. The way she had kept talking to him to keep him awake. The way she had ignored the cold, the time, the risk of missing her own bus home, because leaving had not felt like an option, and her chest tightened as she looked at him again. Really looked this time, searching for something familiar, something that connected the man in front of her to the one in her memory, and maybe it was there, buried under time and circumstance, something in the eyes, in the steadiness of his voice. But she still could not fully accept it. Not when accepting it meant opening a door she had kept closed for years. People do that, she said quietly, though she knew not everyone did. It does not mean anything more than that. And Adrian held her gaze, not challenging her, not dismissing her, just waiting, as if he knew she needed to hear the next part whether she was ready or not. It meant everything to me, he said finally, and the simplicity of it made it harder to ignore, harder to push away. Because that night was the only reason I am still here. And the words settled heavily between them, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just undeniable. And Lily felt something shift inside her, not fully understanding what it meant yet, but knowing it changed the shape of this moment, the shape of why he was standing here now. Looking at her like this was not coincidence, but something that had been unresolved for years, and she opened her mouth to respond, to say something that would bring this back to something manageable, something logical. But before she could, his voice came again, softer this time, but more direct, cutting through everything else. Your son, he said, bringing her back instantly, grounding her in the present she could not escape. He needs surgery tonight. And she nodded immediately, the urgency returning in full force. Yes, she said, her voice breaking slightly despite her effort to control it. And I cannot pay for it. And there it was, the truth laid bare, no defense, no pride left to protect, just the reality she had been trying to outrun all day. And Adrian did not hesitate, did not ask another question, did not negotiate or delay. He simply looked at her with that same unwavering certainty and said, "Then I will handle it." As if it was the simplest decision in the world, as if the problem that had been crushing her for hours could be resolved with a single sentence. And Lily blinked, the words not fully registering at first, her mind struggling to catch up. You cannot just, she started, instinctively pushing back, because nothing in her life had ever been that simple, nothing had ever been handed to her without conditions, without consequences. But he did not let her finish, not by interrupting forcefully, but by stepping closer again, his voice calm but firm, leaving no space for misunderstanding. I can, he said, and this time there was something different in his tone, something that made it clear this was not an offer, it was a decision. And I will. And for a moment Lily could not speak, could not think, caught between disbelief and the desperate hope she had been trying not to feel, because if this was real, if he meant it, then everything could change in the next few minutes. Everything except one question that still lingered, unspoken but impossible to ignore. Why would a man like him do this for her now? After all these years, unless there was something else he had not told her yet. Lily stared at him, the words echoing in her mind but refusing to settle into something she could trust, because nothing in her life had ever worked like that. Nothing had ever been solved with a simple promise, especially not from a man like him. Someone who stood there with complete certainty while her entire world felt like it was slipping through her fingers, and she shook her head slightly, taking a step back as if distance might help her think more clearly. No, she said, the word coming out instinctively, almost defensively. People do not just step in and fix things like this, not without a reason. Her voice steadier now, not because she felt calmer, but because she needed control, needed something solid to hold on to in a situation that was moving too fast. And Adrian did not react with frustration or impatience. He simply watched her, as if he had expected this. Resistance, as if he understood it better than she realized. You already know the reason, he said quietly, and that only made her chest tighten more, because she did not want that to be true, did not want the past to have this kind of weight over her present. Helping someone one night does not create this kind of obligation. She replied quickly, her mind searching for logic, for something that made sense. You said it yourself. I stayed. I helped. That is it. People do that, and then they move on. But even as she spoke, she could hear the weakness in her argument, because if it had been that simple, he would not be standing here now, years later, looking at her like she was the answer to something unfinished. And he took a slow breath before responding, his voice calm, but carrying something deeper, something more personal. I did not move on, he said, and the honesty in it caught her off guard, stripping away any sense that this was just a transaction or a passing gesture. I looked for you, he added, the words deliberate, each one placed carefully, for months after that night. Then years, every lead, every record, anything that could tell me who you were, where you went, but you disappeared. Lily's eyes widened slightly. The idea of that, of someone spending that much time, that much effort, trying to find her, someone who had clearly had the resources to do it, and still failed. It did not fit into the life she had been living, the small apartment, the late shifts, the constant balancing act just to get through each week. That does not make sense, she said under her breath, more to herself than to him, because it did not. None of it did, and yet here he was, and she was here, and somehow everything was colliding in this one moment. And before she could push further, before she could question it again, the door opened slightly behind her, the assistant who had been silent until now stepping forward with quiet urgency. Sir, I have contacted the billing department, she said, her voice respectful but efficient. They are ready to proceed as soon as authorization is confirmed. And Adrian nodded once, his focus never leaving Lily. Confirm it, he said, his tone leaving no room for delay, and the assistant hesitated just briefly, as if something else needed to be clarified. The full amount, she asked, and he did not even glance in her direction. Everything, he replied, and the simplicity of that word carried more weight than anything else in the room, because it meant the decision was already made, not conditional, not partial, complete. And Lily felt her breath catch again, the reality of what he was doing settling in, not as an idea, but as something that was already happening, something she could not stop even if she tried. And she turned toward him again, her voice quieter now, the resistance still there, but softened by something she could not deny. Why? She asked, not as a challenge this time, but as a question she genuinely needed answered, because understanding it might be the only way she could accept it. And for a moment, just a moment, Adrian's expression shifted again, something unreadable passing through his eyes. Before he answered, his voice lower, more controlled than before. Because I do not believe in coincidences, he said. And then, after the briefest pause, he added, and because there is something you still do not know. And the way he said it made the air between them feel heavier, like the next truth was already waiting, just beyond reach. Something that would change everything once it was spoken. And Lily felt that same uneasy pull return, the sense that this was no longer just about help, no longer just about a debt being repaid, but about something deeper, something tied to her life in a way she had not yet understood. And before she could ask what he meant, before she could push him to explain, the assistant's voice came again from the side, softer but urgent. It is done. And just like that, the barrier that had been standing between her and her son's surgery was gone, removed in seconds by a decision she had not made. And Lily stood there, caught between relief and confusion, knowing one thing for certain. Whatever was about to come next, she was already too far in to walk away. For a moment, Lily could not move, the words "it is done" echoing in her mind as if they did not belong to her reality, as if they were meant for someone else, someone whose life worked differently. Someone who did not spend every day calculating what they could afford to lose. And she felt her knees weaken slightly before she steadied herself, her hand brushing against the back of a chair as she forced herself to stay grounded. Because this was not over. Not yet. Not until her son was safe. And without another word, she turned toward the door, her body already moving, driven by instinct. Stronger than confusion, stronger than fear. And as she stepped into the hallway again, the pace of everything around her seemed to shift, nurses moving with purpose, voices sharper, more urgent. And when she reached the pre-operative area, the same nurse from before looked up immediately, her expression changing as soon as she saw Lily. "We have authorization," she said, relief threading through her professional tone. "They are preparing him now." And Lily nodded quickly, her breath catching. As the words finally became real, as the impossible barrier that had been standing in front of her all day disappeared just like that, and she followed without hesitation, her steps faster now, her heart pounding with a different kind of urgency, one edged with fragile hope. And when she reached her son again, everything else faded, the machines, the staff, the sterile walls. None of it mattered as much as the small hand she reached for, the way his fingers curled weakly around hers. "Mom," he whispered, his voice softer now, and she leaned in immediately, brushing his hair back gently. "I am right here," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "They are going to help you now, okay?" And he nodded slightly, trusting her without question, the way he always did, and that trust settled heavily in her chest, because now she had something to hold on to, something she could not let break. And as the medical team moved around them with quiet efficiency, preparing to take him in, Lily stayed close, memorizing every detail, every second, because she needed to believe this was the moment everything started to change. And when they finally began to wheel him away, she walked beside the bed, for as long as she was allowed, her hand resting lightly against the rail until she had to stop, until the doors closed and left her standing there, alone again in the hallway. But this time the silence felt different, not empty, not hopeless, just waiting. And slowly she turned, her thoughts pulling her back to the one person who had made this possible, the one question still unresolved. And when she stepped back into that room, Adrian was no longer standing still. He had moved slightly, speaking quietly with his assistant. But the moment she entered, his attention returned to her completely, as if nothing else in the room mattered. And for a second neither of them spoke, the weight of what had just happened settling between them. Before Lily finally broke the silence, her voice quieter now, stripped of the earlier resistance, but not the uncertainty. "They are taking him in," she said, the words simple but heavy. And he nodded once, acknowledging it without surprise, as if he had already anticipated every step. "He will be taken care of," he replied, his tone steady, leaving no room for doubt. And she believed him, not fully, not without questions, but enough to stand there instead of running, enough to face what came next. And she took a slow breath, gathering what little control she had left. "You said there is something I do not know," she said, her eyes meeting his again, searching, demanding clarity now that she had nothing left to lose in asking. And this time, he did not delay, did not redirect, his expression settling into something more serious, more deliberate, as if the moment he had been waiting for had finally arrived. "There is," he said, and then he stepped closer, just enough that his voice lowered without losing its certainty. "That night did not end the way you think it did." And the words sent a ripple through her, subtle but undeniable, because whatever she had believed about that past, whatever she had told herself to move forward, it was no longer complete, and she felt her pulse quicken again, not from panic this time, but from the realization that the truth she had been avoiding was about to catch up to her, whether she was ready or not. Lily felt her breath slow, not because she was calm, but because something inside her was bracing, preparing for whatever he was about to say, and she held his gaze, refusing to look away this time, because running from it had not worked before, and it would not work now. "Then tell me," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tension building in her chest. And Adrian did not hesitate, did not soften the truth or wrap it in anything easier to accept. "After the ambulance took me that night, I was unconscious for 2 days," he began, his tone even, controlled, but there was something deeper underneath it, something personal. "When I woke up, I asked about the woman who stayed with me, the one who refused to leave, but no one could give me a name, no one had your information, just a description that was not enough to find you." Lily listened without interrupting, her mind already filling in the gaps, already remembering how quickly everything had happened, how she had left, before anyone asked questions, before anyone could connect her to anything, because staying had never been part of her plan. And he continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "But that was not the part that mattered most," he said, and something in his tone shifted again, more serious now, more deliberate. What mattered was what the doctors told me after I woke up. Lily felt her pulse pick up slightly, the weight of his words pressing in, and she did not realize she had taken a small step closer. Until she was already there, her attention fully locked on him. They said I would not have made it through the night if someone had not kept me conscious until help arrived, he said, and for a moment the room seemed to quiet even further, the significance of that statement settling between them. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, just undeniable, and Lily swallowed, the memory hitting her harder now, not as something distant, but as something that had carried consequences she had never known. You are saying, she started, but could not finish, because the implication was already clear, and Adrian gave a slight nod, confirming what she could not bring herself to say. I am saying you saved my life. He replied simply, and the words landed with a weight that made her chest tighten, not out of pride, not out of relief, but out of something more complicated, something that connected her past to her present in a way she had never considered, and she looked away for a brief second, trying to process it, trying to reconcile the person she had been then with the situation she was in now, and when she looked back at him, her voice was quieter, more grounded. That still does not explain why you would go this far, she said, because saving someone once did not create this kind of moment, did not explain why he had stepped in without hesitation, without condition, and for the first time since this conversation began, Adrian paused slightly before answering, not uncertain, but choosing his words carefully. Because I made a decision after that night, he said, his voice steady again. If I ever found you, I would make sure you never faced something like this alone. And Lily felt that statement settle heavily, not just as a promise, but as something he had carried for years, something that had shaped his actions long before this moment. And she opened her mouth to respond, to question it again, to push back against the idea that her life could intersect with his in such a deliberate way. But before she could speak, the door opened again, a nurse stepping in with controlled urgency. We have started the procedure, she said, her tone professional but reassuring. It will take some time, but everything is moving as planned. Lily nodded quickly, the words anchoring her back to the present, back to the one thing that mattered most. And she let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding, her shoulders lowering slightly as a fragile sense of relief settled in. But even as that relief came, the tension in the room did not disappear, because the conversation she was having, the truth that was unfolding, was not finished yet. And as the nurse left, closing the door behind her, Lily turned back to Adrian, her eyes searching his again. You said that night did not end the way I think it did, she said slowly, bringing them back to the one piece that still did not make sense, the one detail he had not explained. And this time, his expression changed in a way she had not seen before, something more serious, more final, as if the next words would shift everything again. And when he spoke, his voice was lower, more deliberate. You left before the storm cleared, he said, and she nodded slightly, because that part she remembered, that part she had lived. But you were not alone when you did, he added, and the words stopped her completely, her breath catching as her mind struggled to understand what he meant. Because as far as she knew, as far as she had always believed, she had walked away from that night on her own, and yet the certainty in his voice left no room for doubt. And in that moment, Lily realized that whatever she thought she knew about her past, there was still something missing, something that connected directly to her present in a way she had never imagined. Lily felt the world around her narrow to a single point as his words settled in, her mind racing to reconcile what she had always believed with what he was now telling her. Because there had never been anyone else. There had never been a second presence in that memory. Just the storm, the empty street, and the man she had stayed with until help arrived. That is not possible, she said quietly, but the certainty she had relied on before was no longer there, her voice carrying a hesitation she could not hide, and Adrian did not argue, did not correct her. Immediately, he simply held her gaze, allowing the weight of the moment to build, as if he understood that this was something she had to reach on her own. And after a brief pause, he spoke again, his voice steady, but unmistakably more personal now. You left in a hurry, he said. The ambulance had just taken me. The rain had not stopped, and you were trying to get back before the roads closed completely. And Lily's breath caught slightly, because that was exactly how it had happened, every detail aligning with what she remembered. And yet there was more, something just beyond her grasp, something she had never questioned before. You dropped something, he continued, and this time his words landed. Differently, sharper, more precise, and she frowned slightly, her mind searching, replaying that moment over and over. The rush, the exhaustion, the way her hands had been shaking from the cold and adrenaline. But nothing stood out, nothing she could clearly remember losing. And he took a small step toward the table, opening the folder he had set aside earlier, his movements controlled, deliberate, as if this moment had been prepared long before she walked into that room. And when he turned it toward her, Lily's eyes fell to the object inside, her breath catching immediately as recognition hit her without warning. A small silver pendant, worn but unmistakable, the delicate chain slightly tarnished with time, but the engraving still visible, still clear enough to read. And for a second, everything else disappeared. The room, the tension, the questions, all of it replaced by the sudden rush of memory. Because she knew that pendant, she had not just seen it before, she had worn it every day, for years, until the night she lost it without even realizing. That is mine, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, her fingers lifting instinctively as if to reach for it before stopping halfway. Uncertainty holding her back, and Adrian watched her carefully, not interrupting, not rushing the moment, because the realization had to settle fully, had to connect the past to the present in a way words alone could not. You left it behind, he said quietly, confirming what she already knew deep down, and Lily swallowed, her mind spinning as the implications unfolded, because if he had this, if he had kept it all these years, then everything he had said was true, every detail, every effort to find her. It was not exaggeration, it was reality, and she shook her head slightly, still trying to process it. I looked everywhere for that, she admitted, her voice steadier now, but still filled with disbelief. I thought I lost it on the bus, or at work. I never imagined, she trailed off, because the truth was right in front of her, undeniable now, and Adrian closed the folder gently, his gaze never leaving hers. It was the only thing I had, he said, and there was no pride in it, no attempt to make it sound more important than it was, just a simple statement of fact, the only way to find you. And Lily felt her chest tighten again, not from fear this time, but from the weight of everything connecting at once, the past she had tried to leave behind, the present she was struggling to hold together, and the man standing in front of her who had been tied to both without her ever knowing. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence filled with everything that had not been said yet, everything that still needed to be understood. And then Lily took a slow breath, her eyes lifting to meet his again. The confusion still there, but something else beginning to form beneath it, something more grounded, more certain. You said I was not alone when I left, she said, her voice quieter now, but focused, because that was the one piece that still did not fit, the one truth she could not place. And Adrian held her gaze for a second longer before answering, his voice low, deliberate, carrying a weight that made her pulse quicken once more. You were not, he said. And then, after the briefest pause, he added the one detail that shifted everything. You were already pregnant.